welcome back to Rolling Solo. My name is Adam Smith, and I'm excited today to be focusing again on the Tainted Grail, the Fall of Avalon from Awaken Realms. In this video, we're going to focus specifically on diplomacy. Just before we move into the specifics of diplomacy, I first want to make mention for those individuals that are brand new to the channel or missed out on my Tainted Grail showcase, which I concluded at the end of last year, you'll definitely want to check that out before consuming this video so that you have a better understanding of how the game plays before you see the mechanisms within diplomacy during this video, as it'll make a lot more sense in the context of a regular game. So I'm going to link to that in the top right hand corner of this video. You'll see a link up here. You can click on that. It will take you to the full showcase where you can watch that and then come back to this video in order to consume how the mechanisms within diplomacy have changed. For those of you that watched the Rolling Solo showcase for the Tainted Grail at the end of last year will remember that this was the character we used during that solo playthrough. And you'll also notice this player board here has actually changed from how it looked back in that previous version of the prototype. So the prototype I am using now is a more current version of the final product. However, remember that everything that I am using in this video and that you see during this video is still in prototype form and is completely subject to change. But you will notice that some things are different in terms of the actual highlighting and the art, and some of the iconography is even a little bit tweaked here and there, but for the most part it stays mainly the same. Now, we've already used this particular character before in the playthrough, so this time around when we're going to be focusing on showing you the mechanics of diplomacy and not an actual full playthrough, I'm going to choose to show a different character's layout this time around. So we're going to take this character and remove it, and instead we're going to bring into the shot Maggot. And Maggot is already set up as he would be at the beginning of a brand new game where you have absolutely no experience and no bonuses to anything besides what you should have out of the gates. So in this particular case, he has for his attributes 1 aggression, 1 courage, no practicality, no empathy, 1 caution, 2 spirituality where his greatest strength lies. He has 2 food and 2 magic. We're not going to go ahead from the diplomacy deck here for the encounter. We're going to draw the top card off of that and we're going to move straight into a diplomacy example. But just before we go ahead and draw our very first blue encounter and move through how diplomacy works, I want to talk about the fact that this diplomacy deck definitely looks different, again, being that this is a newer version of the prototype for Tainted Grail than the original blue encounter deck you guys might be used to from the end of last year. So the artwork on some of this stuff has been upgraded and changed. Again, all of that could even change going forward as well. The deck on the right, though, is specific actually to the character I'm using, Maggot. So each of these diplomacy decks now tied to a character, and each of these characters have their own diplomacy deck. For instance, there are 4 different colors in this prototype box. There is a blue diplomacy deck that's a starting deck. There is a green one that looks like this. There is a brown one, of which I'm going to be using during the examples, and a gray one too. So there's going to be one for each of the different starting heroes, and of course any additional heroes as well would be my understanding, so that every single deck has a different feel to it, meaning that everyone's contributing different things going along and tying into the attributes that they're strong in. Diplomacy in Tainted Grail is a turn-based confrontation between character or a party of characters and an opponent, represented by the encounter card that's been drawn off the top of the blue encounter deck. Characters are trying to build a long line or sequence of cards with the aim of pushing a marker on the encounter card's affinity track to the very top. In the meantime, the opponent will push the marker in the opposite direction while performing various responses. Some diplomatic encounters allow for 2 alternative approaches or have several stages that you have to essentially win on the affinity track in order to get through successfully. So for instance, we have 2 cards here in front of us. The one on the right is a plague card. That is a diplomatic encounter that we can either choose to evade the infected or, as it says right there in the center, ask for shelter. These are the 2 different rows. We have an option to choose one or the other. You'll also notice a Roman numeral 1 on either side, meaning we only have to successfully get our red cube sitting in the neutral position to go all the way to the very top of the card and sit in green for us to be successful, because there's only one stage. Whereas on the left hand side we have the mourners. In this particular situation, you'll notice that the cube would sit also in the neutral position, but there are two stages in this particular one with no ore between them, meaning we have to actually go across the affinity track successfully twice in a row. So the first stage would be to try to join the crowd by getting this cube up the affinity track to this position. That would complete stage 1 in this row. They would just reset this down to gray, go through the second stage all the way back up to the top in order to successfully complete this card. Remember that a party can always escape a diplomatic encounter simply by applying the penalty shown at the bottom of the diplomatic encounter in the failure section. So in this particular case for mourners, if we wanted as a party to actually go ahead and try to escape this, we would take the failure option, which are having us lose 1 reputation, gaining 1 terror for each point of empathy on our character, and everyone in the party, everyone playing, would be suffering through this failure. Now, if the card has the avoid section, like this plague encounter on the far right at the bottom, then you may decide to bypass the encounter, and in that case, you just need to make sure that you pay all the costs and meet all the requirements stated in the avoid section, then put the encounter card at the bottom of the blue encounter deck and continue the game. The key thing to remember when trying to avoid an encounter is you can only do it before you start it. And of course, it actually has to have the word avoid on the bottom of the encounter as well. So now let's talk about all the different things that we can see here on the diplomacy card. So first off, mourners is considered the card name. Pretty straightforward. Underneath of that is the flavor text. So that's just going to help you get drawn into the situation and understand more so about the choice you have to make, or potentially the stages you have to go through to actually complete this diplomatic encounter. The next thing is the affinity track, which basically lines the left-hand side of the card, has green at the top, red at the bottom, and typically gray right in the middle, although that can change depending on whichever diplomatic encounter you happen to pull. They're not always going to be laid out the exact same way, but you'll always find it on the left-hand side of the card. Many effects can basically push the marker on the track up or down, and some abilities also check whether the marker is currently on red or green or not, and that can actually matter in terms of reactions as well as your card play when putting your chain together. The next thing to look at on the card is the encounter difficulty, which is found right up here at the very top of the card in a banner form, and that essentially will let you know whether it falls into easiest to hardest. There are 4 different levels. This in particular is considered an easy one. Next is the avoid, which if you happen to have the ability to avoid, you'll have a keyword which is located down at the bottom of the card here in order to let you know you could try to avoid the card altogether right from the get-go before you actually move into the diplomatic encounter itself. The next thing is attribute keys. These keys line the right-hand side of the card on this particular one, and these are going to be allowing you to connect keys, granting various bonuses, which you can see down here. This would be considered of a bonus that could potentially chain into multiple movement on the affinity track, or a bonus of an additional card draw. These are affinity keys you're trying to connect based on the attributes that we looked at on our character board earlier. If we have the attributes which match the icons here, then we're able to connect those affinity keys in order to start creating a chain. Next up is stages on a diplomatic encounter. So you can see here, this one's really easily denoted by these Roman numerals right here on each of the rows. And this denotes that you're going to have to go through the affinity track 2 times because there are 2 stages to get through, meaning you're going to have to get this cube, as we mentioned earlier, up to the top spot once. It will then reset. We'll move to the second row and we'll be trying to get this back up to the very, very top again. And then we've successfully dealt with the diplomatic encounter. Now, there's not always going to be stages involved, as we saw with the other example earlier on, so you'll know whether or not there's any stages involved just based on the fact that the actual Roman numeral will be incrementing upwards, and if there are some like 1, 2, 3 or higher, you know you're going to have to go across the affinity track that many times to defeat it. If it's simply just one stage, then it might be a simple 1 row, or it might be 2 rows with an or in between it, giving you a choice of either way to handle that diplomatic encounter. Next, we have the diplomacy table, which is used to determine the response the enemy is going to perform during his phase, or in this particular case, it's a diplomatic encounter, so it's going to be a kind of a reactionary thing. So right here you can see if we're in stage number 1, there is a skull right here, and underneath of it, whenever it activates in stage number 1, this arrow pointing downwards means to move the marker on the affinity track 1 space down. So we're actually making it life a little bit more tough for ourselves, as we're going to have to work that much harder to get it back up to the very top. So that first stage, they're just basically beating down your affinity track down to the bottom, and of course if it ever reaches the bottom and sits there, then you have failed the diplomatic encounter. So that could happen if you never get yourself out of stage number 1 successfully. Now, once you move into stage number 2 on this particular card, you'll notice the icon changes, and that icon is actually tied to the terror icon on your character's playboard, which is another whole track that you have to keep a watch on to make sure that you don't go insane, which involves other mechanics I won't go into in this video. If you want to know more, you can check out my showcase for that one. But again, you can see how depending on which stage you're in, and basically depending on which actual thing you're doing, whether you're joining the crowd or comforting the widow, there's a thematic tie-in to what's actually happening to your character. While you're comforting the widow, maybe she's telling you of how something transpired, and that is what's giving you that horror, which is then making you insane. So all those kind of things can tie into the story of what's really going on. And last but not least is at the very bottom of the card. As I mentioned earlier, there might be an avoid keyword, but in this case there isn't. But there are always going to be rewards at the very bottom, and there could also be a failure there as well. So if there is a failure keyword, then the cost of losing the encounter applies to each party member. So you just follow that all the way through. Every party member would suffer that same fate as we mentioned earlier. If you happen to go through both of the stages on this card successfully by getting this up to the top of the affinity track twice over, in this particular case, we actually would lose some of our terror, which is great because you don't want to go insane, and you actually gain a reputation, which is always a good thing. Now let's talk about actually starting diplomacy in Tainted Grail. So diplomacy in Tainted Grail is going to start whenever the game asks you to draw or pick a card from the blue encounter deck. You can see right here, you'll flip over the top card of that deck, take a look at it, and if you have any open keys on it to the right-hand side, then you are going to have to begin to build a sequence in order to defeat said card. Now we've seen this one already, and this will be the one we use for our very first example. The best thing to do is to grab one red cube and place it in the neutral position on the affinity track. Make sure that you have plenty of space to the right of your diplomatic encounter because you'll be building your sequence there. At this point now, all the party members are going to equip themselves for the encounter. Every individual involved is going to be able to use one item with each specific keyword: weapon, shield, armor, companion, and relic. And you can see 4 of those examples right here: weapon, companion, shield, armor. Relic is not shown, but those are the 5 you can have, and you can have at most one of each of them. So in this particular example, I'm actually not going to take the benefit of any of these particular cards. I'm going to choose to play it as if I had absolutely no bonuses from any equipment currently, although it would be wonderful to start with an extra diplomacy card that this particular companion would allow for, or these fine garments, which would actually allow me to, when starting diplomacy, add 1 to my affinity right out of the gates, which is huge. But for the purposes of this example, I'm not going to basically boost myself up to that level yet. I want to use this for example purposes, so we're going to take these out of play. Next, you're going to want to make sure you've shuffled your diplomacy deck, which at the very beginning of the game is going to have 15 cards inside of it. So the brown diplomacy deck is the one that correlates to Maggot. So I have shuffled this diplomacy deck up, and now I'm ready to begin the very first round of play. The first thing you're going to do is draw cards. Now, if you're playing with 1 to 3 characters involved in the encounter, you're going to be drawing 3 cards out of your deck, and of course every individual playing will be drawing 3 cards. If you're playing solo, you're drawing 3 cards. So in this case, I'm doing exactly that. 3 cards will be drawn. If you're playing with 4 characters, then everyone draws only 2 cards. So now we're going to flip these over, reveal them, and see how a regular round pans out. So now this is my starting hand to begin this diplomatic encounter. I've got Rhetorics, Compelling Sermon, and Holy Verse. Now, the rules state that if I don't like my starting hand, I can reshuffle my deck and draw a new hand, but with one less card than before. And you can repeat this until you have only one card left in your hand. So you can just keep on going if you're not getting what you need to kind of begin your sequence, or you're just not happy with what you're seeing combo-wise. Now we're going to talk quickly about some of the things that are good to know off of the cards in your hand before we start actually chaining them together in a sequence. Now I want to talk quickly about the diplomacy cards themselves and some of the icons we're seeing on the cards we've drawn. So on our 3 cards, we have attribute keys, like these ones right here. There's 4 of them in a clump on this Rhetorics card. We have 2 of them over here on the Compelling Sermon and 4 over here on the Holy Verse. Bonus keys look like this. They have a brown background with a bolt going through them, and you're going to be connecting on those bonus keys, and each of these keys may be connected to one attribute key on the previous card in the sequence. We'll see how that actually gets used during the gameplay as well. Next are the magic keys, which are denoted by these blue outlined keys on the card, and they're not on every single card. Like the Compelling Sermon, for instance, doesn't have one, but the Holy Verse does. And to use a magic key, the key connects if you join its left part with its right part, and you have to spend a point of magic, and you have to have one available in order to make that connection. We'll see that in action when we go through the very first round. There is also what's called a free key, which are these keys at the bottom of the cards, and basically what they're going to do is if you are connecting on attribute keys or magic keys elsewhere, there is a chance, and there's most likely a good chance, you're going to connect some of these free keys together, granting you bonuses, which could potentially, like this one here, up your position on the Affinity track, for instance, or in some cases allow you to draw additional cards. All those kind of bonuses come out of that bottom portion of the card. There are also cards in the diplomacy decks called passive diplomacy cards, and you'll know that they're a passive diplomacy card because they're unlike regular cards. The passive ones have their abilities always visible when in sequence, and to facilitate it, their keys are on the opposite edges of the card. Charges, like this one right here, some cards instruct you to gain those charges, like this one right here, and this icon down at the bottom of the card denotes it triggers when it's placed. So the second that you connect on the attribute key, you're immediately going to trigger this, which says add 2 charges. So when you do this, you're going to go ahead and you're actually going to place some universal marker, which will come in the final game, to denote that you have 2 charges on this card. You're allowed to use pay X amount of charges anytime you want. So you can see right here that you could pay a charge to prevent, in this particular case, a destroying of the last card in your sequence. So if you particularly had a diplomatic encounter where the actual aggressive stance of that diplomatic encounter would be to destroy the last card in your chain sequence that you worked so hard to create, you could actually say, no, it's not going to happen, and you spend one of your charges in order to stop that from happening. Now we're ready to actually see how a diplomacy turn pans out. So the very, very first thing that you do is you're going to pick the character to activate. Now when you're playing solo, this is very easy. You can pretty much skip right past this step because you don't need to pick the active character, but generally if you have more than one person playing the game, players are going to decide who will be the next active character. They pick from characters who have not been activated this turn. They have no time token on their character tray, meaning that at the beginning of a particular diplomatic encounter where there's multiple players, you're going to use time counters sitting on your tray to denote who's activated and who hasn't, and you're going to allow the next character in line to become the active player. But if you're playing solo, you're always the active player, so that's why phase number 1 or step number 1 of diplomacy turn is quite simple for the solo play. Now that we actually know the active character, we're going to go ahead and do a character activation, which is a diplomacy step number 2, including delayed abilities. So there is going to be time where you will have a time token on diplomacy cards, denoting basically time ticking down on a particular card, which will have an effect once those time tokens are all removed. So let's say hypothetically you had a card in sequence here with 2 time tokens on it. At this particular point, you would remove one of those time tokens at this point in the game turn. When it comes around to the next round and this phase comes around again, you remove that last time token from the card and you would immediately trigger or resolve any ability with a time token that's on it. So we don't have any time tokens to deal with, so we can move right past that and head into playing cards during the second step. And we know that we have 3 cards in hand, so it's just a matter of deciding which ones can potentially connect to the attribute keys of the diplomatic encounter that we're trying to succeed at. So now we need to execute our plan. We're going to play cards from our hand and add them into the sequence. And if you fail to play a single card, the enemy benefits from your inaction and gets an opportunity against you. You may also be forced to play a card if you're under panic, but panic is a very interesting mechanic as well as opportunity, which typically is a bad thing because you haven't played any cards. The goal is to play 1 diplomacy card, and remember, when you try to connect your attribute keys, you have to make sure that you actually have the attribute in that number that represents the icon. You have to have it matching on your player board in order for it to successfully connect. The very first card that I'm going to play is the Holy Verse card, and you'll see right here when I go ahead and connect these together, you'll notice that actually the icons here don't look the same. But that's because this particular symbol right here is really, in all essence, a wild symbol and allows you to connect up against anything. So in this particular case, this is a valid connection, and because I do have 1 of spirituality, but in essence I actually have 2, I'm allowed to connect these together. If I happen to have absolutely no spirituality in this area of my board, I couldn't do what I'm doing right now. So having these actually plugged in is huge, and you'll gain and change how this works inside of the game system of the Tainted Grail. And there's a push and pull mechanic in terms of being good at spirituality and poor at practicality, or good at caution and not so good at courage, and back and forth. And these are going to be something you'll be balancing throughout the game, but they also come into play during combat and diplomatic encounters. So this is going to help you guys understand what this particular symbol is. Even though I referred to it as a wild symbol, you'll notice that actually on the diplomatic encounter itself, it has that same symbol. So why is that there? Well, when this actually gets connected in this fashion, you reference this particular table and of course which stage you're in for this particular diplomatic encounter, meaning that we're in stage number 1. And you'll notice that if either of these 2 are being used on the connection with this particular symbol, whether it be in this case spirituality or empathy, spirituality being the owl and empathy being the dove, then you actually get to raise the affinity track by 1. So because I connected this together and based on this diplomatic stage 1 session here and that key tying into the same key that I used, it says I can bump this up because I am using the owl, so this will go up to the 1st position. On top of that, you then look down at the bonus section at the bottom and you'll note that I've got a ×1 next to this arrow going up, and we talked about this earlier being a move of the marker on the affinity track 1 position up, and in this case 1 times that is 1, which means we'll be getting a bonus of moving this up to the 2nd position on the track already. So now that we played our 1 diplomacy card, we are allowed at this point in time to play any number of bonus action cards. And bonus action cards have a brown back on the card with a lightning bolt. So if you have any of those in your hand, you're able to play them if you'd like to. So I could go ahead here and use this particular one, and the icon I'm looking for bonus actions is this one right here. And you can see it would connect up against the caution attribute. It also connects down here with this particular symbol, and these are magic keys as we talked about earlier. This would allow me to actually go ahead and gain a card if I use magic to trigger the key connection there. I can place 1 magic from my player board, which there's an actual magic spot with a recessed area, and right now I have 2 magic, so I spend 1 of those magic to connect on there, and I'm going to gain and immediately draw an additional card. Alright, so I've gone ahead now and drawn a new card from my diplomacy deck as a result of the bonus action that I got off my sequence, and I got backtrack. And you can see here there's nothing else we can use during this bonus phase of this particular step because I no longer have any icons in the key sections on my cards that are a brown card with a lightning bolt anywhere. So at this point in time, that step is done, and now we're going to go ahead and check our affinity level. Completing the affinity check is actually very straightforward. You're going to check the position of the marker on the affinity track. So in this case, I'm just one away from the top position. If we were in the highest slot position, then we win the current stage of the encounter. If we happen to only have one stage, that would mean we successfully completed the encounter. Although in this case, having two stages, we would reset back to neutral and begin the second stage. Now, if the affinity track has us all the way down here at the very bottom of this affinity track, then you lose the encounter, apply the failure rules to each party member that was involved, and put the encounter on the bottom of the diplomacy deck or encounter deck and reshuffle that deck. Now, as part of the affinity check, we're also going to do the enemy's response, which we talked about earlier, which is underneath this skull here in this particular column. We're in stage number 1, and that symbol represents us moving our tracker on the affinity track down by one position, so simply just drop it down like so, and we have completed the enemy's response. Now at this particular time, because we are playing this solo, we would be moving to the end of turn phase, but if you are playing with multiple characters involved in this diplomatic encounter, then you're going to be checking to see whether or not the time token's been removed off the player board, or in other words, whether that player involved in the gameplay has actually had a turn to go against this particular diplomatic encounter, because everyone gets to go once before the full round is done. Again, playing solo, pretty straightforward. We're going to move right to the end of phase now. So what happens during the end of turn phase? Well, first off, you're going to look at the cards in your hand, and if you have more than 3, you're going to discard down to have 3 at most in your hand. Next, every player involved is going to draw one card from their diplomacy decks into their hand. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead now and draw a brand new diplomacy card, which is going to sit in my hand, which I can use going into the next round. However, you will not draw a card into your hand if your character panics. So what is panicking inside of the Tainted Grail? Well, panic takes place anytime your terror level is higher than your current health level. So if you happen to panic during a diplomatic encounter, there's a couple things that are going to happen. First off, instead of playing a card from your hand like normal in step number 2 when you're playing your cards, you're going to play a card from the top of your diplomacy deck first, which is going to throw a curveball at you strategy-wise, as you're not going to know exactly what keys you're going to be using, and it might actually adjust how you're going to sequence your cards. Then going forward, you play as normal, pulling one diplomacy card out of your hand and playing it as you would normally. And then of course, if you have any bonus actions you can connect in there, you can as well. Simply the idea behind it thematically is you've panicked and it's kind of got you out of sync. You also make sure not to draw a new card at the end of turn, and any bonus though, or cards gained from bonus keys, skills, or abilities are still drawn as normal though. Whenever your character has to draw any diplomacy cards and their diplomacy deck does not have the required number of cards, you are forced to escape. So you would apply standard escape rules at that particular time. During an encounter, if you ever have your health drop to the 0 position, your character gets the "You Are Dying" card. These are a deck of cards and you will draw one of them. Among other rules, the card immediately terminates the encounter that you're involved in, and then you simply follow the card to determine what happens next. During an encounter, if you would ever have to discard a card from your hand, but you don't have any cards in your hand, you instead discard a card from the top of your diplomacy deck. This reference card was included within the prototype for the Tainted Grail and shows the icons as well as what those icons mean when moving through a combat encounter or a diplomatic encounter. You can see here that it mentions about the keys, drawing of the cards, destroying a card, bonus actions, and everything else you'll need to know to understand the cards as you move through building out your sequence to take down or complete a particular encounter. So we're going to go ahead and begin our second round of play, and I'm going to use that card I just drew called the Heroic Presence. We're going to place it just like this. Now, one thing to mention, guys, is when you're playing your very first card, you're going to ignore the bonus key right here. So that particular action that you would use in the second stage of this playing cards, I'm ignoring that because I'm focusing on connecting on a different key instead. So I'm connecting by choice between this 2 for spirituality right here with this drawing of 1 card, which is huge. And because I'm connecting through this, I also gain the bonus of moving this particular affinity track up by 1 space, as well as drawing a card immediately. So I'm going to go ahead and move this up 1. We're going to draw 1 card from the Diplomacy deck, and I got Flash of Insight, something that I might be able to use right away. There's also this right here, and this particular icon on the card states to put 2 charges on any card in the sequence. And charges, as I mentioned earlier, can be spent in various ways based on the abilities of cards that we may see as we build out our sequence. So I'm going to choose to put the 2 charges, seeing as I can put them on any one, way at the very, very beginning. I'll put them on the first card that I played because that's the one that's likely to stick around. If we were playing a combat against somebody that was an actual monster or a diplomatic encounter that had the ability to remove the card at the end of your sequence, the strategic choice of where to put these charges matters, because if you put them at the end like this, and a particular ability says to remove the last played sequence card or the one at the very end of the row, you'd lose all your charges. So this one is a very, very good card, and that allows for the Heroic Presence to put the charges anywhere I want. So I'm going to kind of keep them on this back card here, and that should keep them safe. And we're going to continue on now, but now we're into our bonus action time frame. So I can't just play any card I want for the regular keys. I have to actually go for those bonus keys now. And looking at my current slot setup, I actually do have some interesting options here. So I'm going to go ahead and play the card I just drew, which was the Flash of Insight. And I'm going to connect it down here like this. And I can do that again, remember, because I'm part of the bonus action phase. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and connect this magic key up here with 1 thing of magic from my player board. The other thing that I'm going to gain by placing that magic is I can draw an additional card. So I'm going to go ahead and do just that, and I got Holy Verse. Now this is one I can't play right now. There's no more bonus action icons like this bolt on it, so this is where I'm going to have to stop for the turn as my hand has kind of run out of options. But it also says right here on the card, we always want to reference abilities. If you're happening to remove the last card in your sequence, then you actually will be forced to drop your affinity track down by 1 and draw a card. So that's very reactionary dependent, and you play this in most cases when you have something here that will affect your affinity track and you know it's coming, because it will actually benefit you by giving you an additional card. Not so much in this situation, but it does open up a bunch of keys for me that I can actually use, which is quite useful. So now that I'm done playing cards, I'm going to check my affinity track, and no, it is not in the top section of the card just yet, sadly, so I won't be able to complete stage number 1 right now. So what we're going to go ahead and do next is we're going to do the enemy response, which we know is going to have us reducing the affinity track down by 1. So they're slowly hitting me back down to neutral, which isn't exactly fun. Next up, we're going to make sure that our hand is actually at 3 at maximum, and it currently is, so I'm okay there. And we move into drawing a card, so I'll go ahead and draw a card. And I ended up getting this one, which is huge. It's called Mystic Calmness, and you'll notice it has those icons that we so desperately need to potentially push this up the track. And look at that, it might even make it go all the way to the top. So before we begin this next round, one thing to note is that I have burnt all of the magic that I had on my character using them during this sequence so far. So if any more magic key connections come up, I'm not going to be able to take advantage of them. So there is strategy in using those at the times that make the most sense, and not just using them all the time whenever you please. But in this case, I use them to draw some additional cards, which is very handy for building out your sequence. Again, remember though, you're depleting resources that you're going to need within the actual game world of Tainted Grail as well as inside of these encounters. So you have a nice balance there to take care of. Now, one thing that's definitely worth mentioning in terms of starting off your turn and playing your very first diplomacy key is remembering the fact that the very first card, like we talked about way earlier on in the video, does not have to connect to any key on the prior card. Now, you might be wondering, wow, that kind of throws a wrench into things. How does that actually work? Because currently what you guys have seen was a lot of me connecting to previous keys, but that first diplomacy card you lay down does not have to. It just basically will go in line with the sequence and continue forward from there. Of course, once you place that, your first one doesn't have to connect on any key, but then after that you can use bonus actions to connect, of course, to try to drive your affinity track up. So it's really a strategic decision because sometimes the card that you have at the very end of your sequence, or if a particular encounter knocks that card off and now your plan to use one of these keys is no longer an option, then you're probably going to want to play a card that will set you up for a better run going into your new round. So just remember that even though, yes, at the beginning of your turn when you place your first diplomacy card, it doesn't have to connect to any other keys, you're kind of actually shorting yourself a bit because you're not going to gain any great benefits off the keys that, well, don't connect. So you're not going to get anything that's going to help you on the track, and that's just going to slow your progress down. Remember, once your diplomacy deck is gone, you lose the encounter. So yes, you theoretically could actually play 15 straight turns where you only play one card every single turn, but that will ultimately land you in failure and may not line you up with a lot of success as you go along. Whereas if you're trying to line up your keys, then you're obviously going to gain the benefits of some of these particular ones, which will correlate back to the encounter and maybe push the affinity track up faster. Or you might find ones that you actually have skills in on your player board, like we've been connecting so far, where they grant drawing of cards, or sometimes even pushing up on the infinity track. So you really want to chain those things together, because those in combination with the bonuses at the bottom are really going to ramp up your chances of success going through these encounters. So I've made my decision on which card I'm playing next, and it's going to be Holy Verse. I think this one's going to be the best for me for a number of reasons. As you can see here, when I connect this, it's actually going to chain off a number of different things for me. So first off, at the very, very top here, if I have Caution, which is the rat symbol there, which I do have one of up here on my player board, then I'm going to be able to draw a card. So I'm definitely going to do that right now. So I have an additional card in my hand. And I pulled the Elaborate Argument. That sounds like a good one to have as well. Look at the symbols on that one, that can be very useful, plus the bonuses down below. That's great. Next up, we're going to take a look at the next symbol below, and it's for spirituality, connected to basically our wild symbol, essentially. And of course, there'll be an actual term in the final version that won't just be called wild. I'm using that term just sporadically throughout the video to denote this particular symbol right here that correlates to this right here. So we know that whenever we see this, as long as it's an owl, which represents spirituality right here, or it happens to be empathy, which is way up at the top right hand corner of my player board, then we go up on the affinity track. So in this case, we get to go up one space in the affinity track because the owl has one arrow going up. So because I've linked those together and I do have 2 spirituality, which is more than the requirement of 1 that's needed for the 1 owl that's there, I get to bump this thing up 1 on the track. That's great. Then we go all the way to the very bottom where you can see we have a ×1 with another raise of the affinity track. So we have done everything we need to do with this one card using a Holy Verse in this particular play. And I don't need to play any more bonus actions, and there's no need to, because anything else I play bonus action wise would likely not pay off anything in terms of helping me. Now some might give you drawing of cards, but remember that can actually hurt you, because as of right now I have, you may not be able to see this because it's off screen, but I have 4 cards in my hand. Remember, we always have to discard down to 3. So even if you think playing bonus actions is a smart move right now, you might get into a situation where you're going to have to discard back down to 3. So you're not going to really want to use bonus actions once you get your affinity track to the top like this. So we've successfully gone through stage number 1 at this point in time. So now we move into the affinity check stage of our game round, and we're going to see that we're at the very, very top of the affinity track. So when we're at the highest slot, we win the current stage of the encounter. So if this was the last stage, you win the whole encounter, but in this case, we know we have 2 stages. So we're going to reset this tracker back to neutral, knowing that we have to do this one more time through, but now we'll be referencing the second row on the encounter card. Things are going to change up a little bit as we move forward. All right, so we've successfully gone through stage number 1, which is joining the crowd. We're now going to move into comforting the widow for stage 2. You'll notice that the requirements using this particular symbol haven't changed. Everything's the same. We're still using empathy and spirituality to try to move this affinity marker up the affinity track to the top position. Now the column to the right of that is going to show what's going to be happening to us when this individual activates, and it's the AI. So as we know from the first stage, the affinity track kept getting pushed back down. That wasn't so much fun because it could push us into failure. Well, now it's not about us failing the encounter, because really the only two ways for us to fail the encounter is to run out of cards in our diplomacy deck, which is obviously a thing that can happen if we draw this out too long, or we could have a situation that can increase that dramatically if we take so much terror, which is what this symbol is right here every time it activates, that our terror level is higher than our health. And if it ever becomes higher than our health, whenever we start our turn, instead of being able to play a card out of our hand at free will, we have to take the top card from our diplomacy deck and play it in. Meaning we've already burnt our ability to basically set things up for ourselves and have a really nice sequence. We're taking a card, putting it in the sequence that's going to disjoint things. It doesn't need to connect on any key, but it's literally burning time on us because we've just spent a card out of sync and got nothing for it on the keys. So that is definitely a downside. Plus, during that same turn, the only thing that's going to be useful is any bonus actions you can connect, which are these brown card symbols with the electricity or the thunderbolt icon inside. Those are the only ones you'll be able to use. And if it happened to me right now, for instance, I currently, as of this moment, have 4 cards in my hand and not a single one of them has that particular symbol. So a turn would be completely wasted, and you can see how that could really mount up to failure in the end. Alright, so we've now made it to the end of turn phase, and for the first time ever during this example, I actually have more cards than the 3 I'm allowed to have as of this moment of time in the round. So currently we have to discard down to 3 cards. So I have Elaborate Argument, which I just picked up, which is an awesome card because, as you can see here, this could really chain into some successful movements on the affinity track. So I don't want to get rid of this card here. We also have Compelling Sermon, which is a really great card as well. This one can connect, giving us bonuses, plus potentially give us the ability that triggers right away to discard any number of cards and go up 2 and take 1 hit for stamina for every 2 cards we discard in this way. So it's kind of like a triggering thing that happens the second you play it in and get it in your sequence. You can trigger this, discarding a number of cards to get that bump up, take some stamina hit. It sounds like a pretty good thing, so I'm going to hold on to that as well. And we also have Mystic Calmness, which is again a great card too. This one has the ability to use that particular wild symbol and be able to, again, move things up the track as long as it attaches to the correct attribute that we're going after from the encounter card. And last but not least, we have Backtrack. This is the one that I think I'm going to let go because I'm not really worried about this card or any needing of any use for this card during this particular stage. This would have been better in the last stage because you can see here when it triggers, it actually raises the affinity track if you're not in the green. But we know that now the AI will not be pushing the affinity track into the red anyway, so that ability becomes essentially useless for us. And we also have the very different mentality with this card of it being much stronger on the right-hand side than it is on the left-hand side. Still a great card and is useful in certain situations, but right now this is the weakest link, so it is going to be taken out. And the last thing we're going to do for the end of the round is draw a card. So we're going to go ahead and draw, and I've got the Eye for Detail. I sure hope I do anyway. So in this particular case, we have a couple icons we can definitely use, as we have Caution, we know we have Spirituality, and that wild symbol is always great. But what we do have down here is a very brand new ability that I haven't seen so far in this encounter, which has to do with these time tokens. So essentially, if I play this card into my sequence, this time token gets put on the card, which is what that symbol represents, and then it says draw 1 extra card. Well, when do you draw it? Not when you actually place in your sequence, but in the coming round, there is a time frame where at the very beginning of the round, you're looking for any of those time tokens and you're triggering those by removing one off and doing its effect. So at that particular time, you get to draw an additional cards. You're kind of setting yourself up for better things later on. Still a very useful thing to have. So now we just have to decide which of these 4 cards we are going to be playing to begin our sequence for that first diplomacy card. So to start us off here, I'm going to go ahead and play a elaborate argument, which is one of those ones with all those wilds. And you can see down at the bottom there, we got the bonus too. This is really great for me on the Affinity track. So this one here, again, we have to make sure we actually have one of those two keys, or either of them actually makes sense for this particular symbol over here. So the only one that makes sense is the owl. So we can connect on it because it's for 2, and we definitely have 2 in spirituality. You can see the icon has 2 owls there kind of clumped together. So we are going to be able to go up the Affinity track just from that connection for 1. Plus you look down at the bottom, we have a ×1 on a move up the Affinity track. So now we're in the 2nd position. We are 1 away. Now the only thing is, remember, now we move into bonus actions. We have to find any cards that have this brown back with the electric bolt, and we can play as many of those cards as we want right now. Fun news is I don't have any, so I'm not going to be able to go any further than where I'm at right now, as these are the only cards that I have in my hand currently. So one thing you may have noticed, for those of you that have an eye for detail, is you might have noticed earlier on in the video here that I didn't really have any red cubes at all in this energy, health, and terror track, unless I was actually giving an example. Well, that's because we're playing this whole encounter out of or disconnected from an actual playthrough. So in this particular case, I want to show you what panic can do for you, which is not a good thing in a situation when it actually triggers, because in this particular case, this is where the AI would actually go ahead and do its thing. In the 2nd stage, it will give me a terror, which means my terror is going to go up on the track. Now, one thing to really note here is that your health will not be denoted by a red cube in the final version. It's actually going to be a T marker. And what that means essentially is it will sit like this with a full block in this area, but will also have a line that will go straight across the top of it, a dividing line, to make it easier and visually more appealing to see whether or not certain cubes are above your health or not. It's just a lot nicer. I don't have one here in the prototype, but you can see the difference even with the cubes anyway. So you can see here our terror has now moved up 1 higher than our health. So panic is going to set in at the beginning of this particular turn coming up. So as you can see right now, the Widow has scared us even further, and we're actually 1 stage away from going insane, which is another whole ball of wax I'm not going to get into during this particular video. If you want to see more about that, the showcase will talk more about that, or future videos from Awaken Realms. So we're moving into the end of turn phase, but just before we do that, I want to talk quickly about the ability on this card. I just want to clear it up for those wondering, and basically that red terror card means if you destroy the last card of your sequence, you're going to move your marker down on the Affinity track. So besides the actual encounter itself trying to force you into failure, some of your cards can actually do that to you as well. So we've now made it to end of turn phase, and we're going to be going ahead discarding down to 3 cards. I only have 3 cards, so we're golden there. The next step is to draw a card, but we will not be drawing a card. And you're wondering why? Well, because we're panicking, and we don't get the advantage of drawing a card for our diplomacy deck when we're panicking. So we're going to have to just live with the 3 cards that we have, but it's not just that affects us when we are in panic mode. The other thing that happens is that instead of being able to play a card straight from our hand, as I mentioned earlier, we have to play it straight off our diplomacy deck. So we're going to draw the top card, and we got Staunch Defense. Now again, remember, we can ignore everything here because nothing here has to connect on the very first diplomacy card. So what I'm going to do to make that obvious is I'm just going to leave a little bit of a disconnect between the cards, and that'll help us remember kind of where we were and what things didn't need to be connected. So this is the first diplomacy card being played. It was forced upon us, and at this particular time we can only play additional diplomacy cards, which is essentially those cards that have that bonus action on them, and I don't have any. So this whole turn as of right now is a wash. So we wrap right back around again to the end of turn phase, and you can see how being in a panic state is really, really bad, because what ends up happening is you're just panic playing through the encounter, hoping that you can land a key that will succeed in your encounter, and it gets really, really sketchy really fast. So I have 3 cards. I can't discard down any further. It tells me normally to draw a card. I'm not allowed to do that. We have to play a card off the top of the deck. If we continue forward in this regard, I'm not going to keep showing this hand, but I'm going to start showing you kind of how things are happening in our sequence as we randomly start panicking every single time that we start our turn. So the next card coming off the top of the deck that could throw a wrench into things is this one right here. Oh, this is brutal. So this one's played, and again, The only reason, just so you guys are aware, that I separated this one away was just so that I remember that these ones don't matter on the first diplomacy card coming out. That's why I separated them, because you can't connect on those bonus actions on the very first diplomacy card of your turn. Same thing here for Mind Trick, can't connect on this one, but if I had have had magic, any magic available in here, I could have actually connected Mind Trick right here, and this would have actually given me the affinity track. But even though I panicked into it, it would have given me what I needed to bump this thing up by 1, and I would have succeeded. But I've already burnt all my magic out, so this is another one that ends up going in here and doesn't help me. Now, another thing that you're going to notice on this card right here is there's an immediate effect here ability on this card. It says toss a dial. So if we toss the dial and it's a skull, our affinity track goes down. If we toss the dial and it goes up, we actually get it. So as of right now, again, this Mind Trick could get us out of this sticky situation, even though we're panicking through it. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to grab this coin here, which has the skull on one side and the grail on the other, and we're really going to hope that this lands on the grail side. So here we go. Yep, we got it. It's the grail side, and it almost took out every single thing on this board. But we got it. We landed it. That was super lucky. Not only was the flip lucky, but getting this card was also lucky. This bumps us up to the top of the track. And even though we were panicking and could have got into kind of a snowball effect where we just started placing cards like crazy and not getting what we needed to a point where we fail, that would have been bad. Another thing to note, guys, off screen, I only have 3 cards left. So we were in a situation where only 3 turns I was going to fail, because if you can't draw from that deck when you're required to, you automatically fail the encounter, just like if you have this affinity track marker pushed all the way to the bottom. So again, everything's not going to come down to chance, but I really wanted to show you kind of how essentially panic could work and how it could really throw a wrench into your plans of trying to succeed in an encounter. I really hope this video was informative in showing you how diplomatic encounters work. Thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, keep on rolling solo.